Well, I guess I'll just run through the paintings as they are. So I have a little group of symbols or icons that I use, and it has expanded a bit over the years. But right now it is a teepee, which uses 3 mops, a diamond, which uses 4, a pentagram uses 5, a Star of David uses 6, the sun uses 7, the fish uses however many it uses. I don't think that I've figured out how to make the fish exactly. What I did was I took a bunch of strips of cardboard. Usually I use stretcher bars which connect at both ends, and certain shapes can be made in that way, connecting both ends. But when I wanted to use mops, I understood that different shapes were possible because there are no ends, so they can just lay on top of each other. So I just sat down strips of cardboard and glued them together to see what shapes could be recognized. I thought of them at first. I developed these in Italy, in Rome. Me and my family were there for the past 6 months at the American Academy. And when I was laying these out, I thought of them as constellations. So originally these were constellation paintings in my mind. And sometimes I would squint so I could only see the mop heads. So they're just the stars in the sky. And the way that our ancestors figured out what a constellation meant, its meaning, was they looked at it and one of them said, oh, that looks like a cat, right? And the other one said, no, it looks more like a duck. And he would say, okay, yeah, you're right, it looks like a duck. And then they would have to figure out what specific duck it was. So maybe in their mythology, God turned into a duck one day in order to accomplish something. So obviously that's that duck. So I wanted to find meaning in that kind of communal way. That desire started many years ago. I made a series of paintings. They were double paintings connected by a toy chicken. And the thing painted on the paintings were symbols: lightning bolts, stars, clouds, hearts, maybe arrows. They were symbols of things that didn't look like what they represented. That was how I was thinking of it. And one of them was a Star of David between 2 chickens, but I was just thinking of it as a star shape like all the other shapes. And a little girl walked into the gallery and she said, look, Mom, a Jewish chicken. And at first I was like, well, no, little girl, this is just an abstraction. I'm an abstract painter. They don't have any meaning. But that was like the 2 people saying, oh, is that a duck? And the other person's like, no, it looks more like a monkey. And neither of us has authority. So I liked that I couldn't tell the girl that that's not a Jewish chicken. Like, I don't have that authority over what symbols mean. So anyway, I arranged the mops until I recognized a shape. And now I have to figure out, so I know now that that's the sun. But I think that paintings ought to be specific in their meaning. So a painting shouldn't be about the human condition. It should be about that guy on that day in that situation, like Rembrandt's Night Watch. Like a painting takes you to some specificity. So my mythology is the news. So I go on the New York Times and I type in the sun, and the New York Times tells me what specific sun we're talking about. So this one is Titus Jones of the Phoenix Suns. And then I go to that news story and I take enough names to occupy all of the chickens or the or hand turkeys in America. To occupy all the hand turkeys, so they're all characters in that particular story. I have big hands, so sometimes only one of my hands will fit in a painting. I always end up doing things as a painter that I think are bad in a way. So like whenever a painter puts a shoe on a painting, like they nail a shoe to it, I always think, oh, he doesn't get that the technology of painting allows you not to do that. Like you could just make a picture of a shoe And you could even make a picture of an infinite number of shoes in a painting, because you can paint into the painting through depth. But I use a collage strategy that doesn't allow me to do that. So I can't paint infinite turkeys. I can only make as many as will fit in a single plane. I trace my hand 4 times and then superimpose them. I trace the same hand in the same way all 4 times, but it always ends up different. So they never lay on top of each other correctly. So that color there shows the not lining up. I just line up the thumb. So what should a painting have? I should also tell you my idea of abstraction. Rene Descartes, who was a mathematician, he was once writing a letter to somebody explaining what abstraction was. And he said, abstraction, I'm paraphrasing, is when you consider in isolation things that do not occur in isolation. So like the nervous system is an abstraction. You would never see a nervous system walking around. That would be absurd. And the insights we learned from abstraction, because abstraction contains this kind of absurdity, and he made a distinction between abstraction, which is absurd, like the nervous system, and exclusion, which is when you separate things that we actually only connected by habit, but they actually are 2 separate things. But anyway, so the insights you learn from abstraction, the nervous system, only have use when you take them back into the total system. So you can do medicine when you take that abstraction back into an actual body. So I'm always trying to take what I learned about painting, which in my day was kind of late modernism. It was a kind of abstraction. The New York School painter, I think my first ever art review in the New York Times, I think maybe they called me a New York School painter. Like painting back in those days when I was a kid was this late modernist abstraction. And I'm always trying to take what I learned from that and put it back together into a complete picture. So one of the things I think a complete picture has is a specific subject. Another thing, I think that it has living things like animals, plants, atmospheric effects like smoke and light, maybe cosmic objects like planets and asteroids, and maybe narrative. So I tried to include all those things. There's rainbows, hearts, pie charts, eclipses, planets, snowflakes, 4-leaf clovers, and that's pretty much it. Okay, pentagram, I looked it up on the New York Times. American Star Review, it was a movie called American Star, I believe. One name, Ian McShane, who I think is the star of the movie. His birthday, which I can't read. Okay, so I'm trying to make a complete picture again. So I need multiple people. Because another thing that happened in painting as it was taught to me, there was a kind of figurative narrative painting, which was very utopian in nature. What that means is that it was a world, I think my first exposure to the concept of utopia was probably, who wrote The Republic? Socrates? Plato? Okay. Plato's Republic. And he said that when he tried to figure out what a perfect world would be, and he said the perfect world would actually be a world where everyone was the same person. Because in such a world, you actually don't even need politics. So the rest of the book explains how the kind of violence you need in order to make a place where everyone is the same and to keep them the same. He mentioned that the actual laws and traditions you would have in a utopia are irrelevant. The real problem is making everybody be the same person. So the kind of painting that happened when I was coming up was very utopian. It was paintings of worlds filled with one person. All people with black skin, all women shaped in a certain way, et cetera, et cetera. And so it left this problem of painting a world where different people might exist simultaneously. And so I found something in criminology, which is called a topology of victimhood. it allows you to understand everyone as a kind of victim, and therefore as the same sort of a thing. And what that allowed me to do was I could put Trayvon Martin and his murderer in the same picture. You couldn't do that in figuration, in contemporary figuration, because contemporary figuration is meant to signal how you should feel about a person by how they are depicted. So you couldn't put two people you were meant to feel different ways about in the same picture. So this only has one person. It's not a good example. Ian McShane, completely guilty victim. This also has one person. This is a painting of a teepee. It's specifically a teepee which is being cleaned. It's an article in the New York Times about cleaning tents. So the person, Chris Pottinger, his birthday is there. He is a completely innocent victim. This piece has 3 people in it. So the more people who can be in a story, the more complex the story can be. They can start to interact with each other. This is a Star of David. What Star of David specifically? I went to the New York Times to find out. It's sort of like reading tea leaves to find out what the subject of the painting is. Because I don't want, like with the little girl or with the co-caveman, I don't want to be the one, I don't want to arbitrarily decide the subject of the painting. I don't want to be the arbiter of meaning in that way. So this is about a moment in the UN when the Israeli representative to the UN wore a yellow Star of David in kind of protest to the UN's handling of the October 7th terrorist attack. So the 3 people who occupy the space there of subjectivity are Danny Dayan, who is a voluntary victim, Yad Veshem. Yad Veshem was a mistake in research. The New York Times, it's not actually a person, it's a Holocaust memorial in Israel. But the way the New York Times mentioned it, I mistakenly thought it was an individual. I quickly found out it was not, but I wanted to keep the mistake in research. I also keep misspellings and things like that in the paintings too. So Yad Veshem, completely innocent victim. Gilad Erdan, who was the representative, victim with minor guilt. There are rainbows, hearts. The rainbows, I'm very interested in gay pride, the flag, and how the colors continually change and evolve. So every painting is a different rainbow. The hearts contain sometimes stitches, sometimes arrows, sometimes breakages. The cosmic element, which is an eclipse, the eclipse essentially rotates. They're all in kind of a different position. The pie chart, the designated part rotates. Let me see. Okay, so that's 3. In the actual...
Are those snowflakes?
Yes, there are snowflakes, and the line down the middle is a horizon line. So below the horizon, there are bushes and clovers. If anybody remembers old video games like Super Mario Brothers, clouds and bushes were the same sprite. It's just that clouds are green and bushes are white. So I do that same thing. So below the horizon, like the kind of swirly atmosphere is meant to be bushes, and above they're meant to be snowflakes. I don't use color symbolically, so bushes are not green, snowflakes are not white. Everything is an arbitrary color. Every painting is every color every time. So every painting is red, blue, yellow, green, purple, orange, brown, pink. Every painting is that color. The effect is meant to be monochromatic. The first ideas about color, what we call color harmony, was the idea that we desire to see all the colors at once. Therefore, the complement, we would say, of green, which is blue and yellow, would be red, which is the one color missing. And then the complement of orange, which is red and yellow, would be blue, which is the one color that's missing. So that was the earliest idea about color harmony, is that we just wanted completion. So every painting is complete in its palette. And it's also as kind of total paintings, as holistic abstractions, they're meant to be ultimately complete in every way. The list of symbols I have, TP, diamond, Star of David, fish, arrow, sun, star, I'm hoping that those are enough that I could make paintings about anything, about all the things in the world through the filter of the New York Times or other news sources. So, yeah, that's all I'll say about the paintings, but I will give you a little dictionary of words I think that are important to understand my practice and what I think those words mean. So I think the first word is suffering. Suffering is hard to define, but I could describe it. In Buddhism, they say there's three types of suffering. There's physical suffering, there is the suffering of lacking, and then there's the suffering of knowing that life can never be what you want it to be. And in Buddhism, our lives are defined by suffering. The level of reality we exist on, which is I think called samsara, is a level of inflicting and enduring suffering, right? And when you transcend, you get out of this level of inflicting and enduring suffering. I was raised as a Catholic, so we were taught to only really think about the suffering that we inflicted on other people, which we called sin. We were not supposed to think of our own suffering necessarily, which we were taught we have coming. We have an image in Catholicism, which is Christ on the cross, and there are two people next to him, which are also on the cross being crucified. They're two thieves, and the image is meant to demonstrate the difference between transcendent suffering and mundane suffering. So the suffering of the thieves is mundane. They actually deserve it, the way we all do. And Christ's suffering is transcendent. So that's suffering. Oh, maybe another thing. I think the big art thing that happened when I was at the age of wanting to be an artist, like late high school, in the mid-90s, was the 1994 Whitney Biennial, which they used to call the Victim Biennial. And a lot of the artists there, Glenn Ligon, Nan Golden, Sue Williams, Byron Kim, those people became my teachers, my mentors, people I knew, and they also are often who my art is about. And the difference between that, because I believe that existence is defined by suffering, but the difference was that 1994 biennial was about what I would call identitarian suffering, which is different from existential suffering that Buddhists were talking about. And the difference is identitarian suffering is historicized and it's also politicized. So like when I suffer as a black person, I imagine that black people in the past had the same suffering and that black people in the future will have the same suffering. So I imagine myself as being a part of this historical identity that's suffering, not an individual. And by politicized, I imagine that political power is the source of my suffering, my identitarian suffering. Therefore, if I vote for Kamala Harris, it will reduce my identitarian suffering. And if I vote for Donald Trump, it will increase my identitarian suffering. So identitarian suffering is historicized and politicized. And it's attractive. There's a desire I think we have to politicize all suffering, because if all suffering is political, it can be solved through political action. We could stop suffering through political action, which I think is attractive. So anyway, back then is when identity art came into being, as far as I know, this art about identitarian suffering. So that's the thing, suffering, identitarian suffering. Abstraction, I think I already said. How about beauty? Okay. So beauty is an aesthetic. It's like a way things are. In the same way delicious is a way food is. Different foods taste differently, and delicious is a way things taste. So it's a paradox that different things can both be delicious and taste different. It's a paradox that two paintings which look different can both be beautiful. There was a philosopher, Friedrich Hegel, who proposed what beauty actually is it's our intuition of human freedom. So for example, for some people, he said that there were three kinds of people, three kinds of beauty. For classicists, beauty can actually be embodied in a thing in the world. So like a strong, wealthy, free, healthy human person is the embodiment of freedom for some people. For other people, beauty can be pointed to by a situation in the world, like an old man helping a child learn to tie their shoes. Those two people are not in themselves beautiful. One is an old man, and the other is just a child with a dirty face or something. And he called those people romantics. So for the romantics, you can point to beauty through a situation which is not in itself beautiful. That's also like Christ on the cross is not in himself beautiful. There are some Christs that are like, you know, sexy and muscular. Yeah. And the last was abstraction, which, so for those people, beauty not only is never embodied in the world, freedom is never in the world, and it can never even be pointed to. Freedom is in the inner life, in the spirit world, in the world of the dead, and can never be seen. It can be done. I can do freedom, or I can point to freedom through my acts of originality and unexpectedness. And I guess that's more my orientation. So beauty, suffering, identitarian suffering. I think that's enough. So are there any questions? I'd be happy to address them. Pardon me. How you doing?
I was just looking at it. I came in late, so I don't know if we spoke about the non-painting elements of the work already.
There are no non-painting elements.
Okay, talk about the mouth heads and the belts and the spoons.
I want my paintings to seem countercultural and antisocial. So culture is a multi-generational way of learning how to do something. So like tying your shoes, there's different cultures. People tie this way, people that. Cooking rice, there are different cultures of how to cook rice. And there are cultures around how to make pictures and how to paint. But I don't want my paintings to look like somebody taught me how to do it, right? So that's countercultural. I want it to look like I just needed to do something. I think about mysticism a lot. My favorite aesthetic is probably voodoo, where like there's a candle in a Coke bottle. Like it seems very immediate. And I think of like a pentagram scrawled onto a floor. You walk into a room, there's a pentagram scrawled on the floor. There's an immediacy to the need of having done that. So I'm trying to, W.C. Fields once said that in acting, sincerity is the most important thing. And once you can fake that, you've got it made. And so I'm trying to produce the aesthetic of immediacy, right? Even though these actually take a long time to make. Like the mops take time to make. It took me more time to make a mop than to buy a stretcher bar. And yet I want them to seem more desperate. I don't know if they feel that way enough. If like the spoons and the mops and the belts seem desperate enough. I believe that art is about suffering. Like Star Wars is about suffering. It's about the suffering of Luke Skywalker or Darth Vader or whoever. Spider-Man is about suffering. I think that what the biennial in '94 did was it just expanded the kind of suffering. Like it wasn't the suffering, as they say, of dangerous white boys anymore, but other sorts of suffering. And I want to keep that, you know? I want to keep that expanded field of suffering. And also, I just saw a really great show of painting in Chicago. It was a brilliant, wonderful painting. But there's a problem with painting that other mediums don't have, which is when I see a great painting, I'm like, man, that person really likes painting. They like painting so much they went home and made one. And I can even tell what paintings they like, because they made one, there it is. But I don't get that feeling in sculpture or in video. Like a video of school children, I'm like, oh, they really like school children. And video is as good a way as any to record the children or to do whatever. But in painting, the medium always seems in front of the meaning, right? So I don't think that these paintings seem like I went somewhere and saw a painting and I was really enamored by it and went home and made one myself. And I think that is the anti-cultural part, although that is actually exactly what I did, but I don't want it to look that way. And the anti-social part, I think another thing about the '94 biennial and the idea that if all suffering were political, then we could solve it through political action. Well, and another way to say that is if all suffering was symbolic, we could solve it through symbolic means. And I think that once that idea took over, art got a job. Like art had an institutional job, which is to symbolically address, the kind of symbolic transformation of suffering. And I don't like when art has a job. So that's the antisocial part. And this is unfair of me because, I was in Rome and I went to churches and there were Giotto paintings and all these paintings that clearly have a job. They're employed by the church to do a specific thing. And our kind of institutional decolonization work and so forth is no worse than that work that those paintings are doing in the church. So it's unfair of me. And I'm always trying to figure out why I'm wrong, because I know that the things I think are no better than the opposite of the things I think. But there is an illusion presented that makes me think certain things are correct. And I'm always interested in how that illusion is produced. So I'm always moving towards the things I think that are wrong about painting.
Yeah, there's a lot I could ask, but I'm also kind of curious, piggybacking on you talked about as a young student, the artists that were your teachers that were in the biennial. How was that as a young artist, having these highly conceptual, very political teachers, and then you also, you talk a lot about abstraction, you talk a lot about almost like seeking out subject matter as a reporter almost, but then maybe turning that into abstraction. Do you feel like the language of painting is almost just like a vehicle to contain a lot of these ideas, and did you receive any pushback? Or was it more of a collaboration with your instructors when you were much younger, that you wanted to be?
In that, to go back to Descartes and abstraction and why I'm attracted to it, I'm attracted to abstraction because of its absurdity, because of how funny it is. Like a minimalist painting that's blue is hilarious. And so I've always been a funny guy as an artist. And so I don't think that I've had certain artists who saw through it and just weren't having any of my bullshit. But most artists don't see entirely through it and have some of my bullshit. And so we have a fun relationship. So I think that most of my mentors, I have a fun relationship of misunderstanding what they're doing in a funny way. So I think I have funny relationship in my attempt, because the thing is you have to transcend what comes before you, right? Which means you have to move through it to get beyond it. Although I have met some of my heroes, like people whose work I really admire, and they often hate my work, Because often I admire these abstractionists, and one of my friends who's a writer was doing an interview with this abstractionist I admire, and he was like, oh yeah, and he mentioned you, like before the interview, you want to hear it, like you have to record it. And of course it was about how he didn't like my work because he didn't think that it was about painting. Like as abstractionists, we're trying to make paintings that have no subject. And these paintings have a subject, and they have a powerful subject. I'll tell you another idea about abstraction, which was Sigmund Freud, who didn't write a lot about art, visual art, but he wrote a lot about jokes, which he also considered to be aesthetic works, what he called the joke work. In the same way that these aesthetic works are meant to elicit an emotional reaction, let's call it being moved or something like that. Jokes are meant to be funny, right? And food is meant to be delicious and that sort of thing. So he made a distinction between two kinds of work. One is contentious jokes that have a subject that you feel a way about, and that feeling is part of the aesthetic. So you tell a joke about Donald Trump, and you will feel stuff about it because you feel stuff about Donald Trump. And the other kind of jokes he called abstract jokes, which are like knock-knock jokes. They're just a working of language without any subject. And he argued that abstract jokes are never as aesthetically energetic as contentious jokes, right? So for an abstract painter that I admire, they think I'm cheating by using contentious subjects. But there's no cheating in art. Yeah, there's no cheating in art. There's no playing fair. Because with the work of the past, you either repeat it or you have to transcend it. Like there's no other choice, you just do it again. And I guess they would like me to have done it again rather than trying to transcend it through humor. I'm sorry, I think you were next.
I was wondering about these like central vertical rectangle kind of forms that the shapes are attached to. Because I don't recognize them from maybe like the series before these or the one before that. And I was wondering how you were thinking about that.
So originally in Rome, they were sticks, and these were picket signs. And I like that, but what I don't want in my work is for you to be able to trace my steps back to my thinking, and then be done. So I was just trying to find something that did that thing, and these do that same thing. Now, maybe they should be made out of mops themselves, but I don't know.
Do you mean like there's an aesthetic pleasure in figuring out what you were thinking and that?
I think the pleasure of figuring out what artist is thinking is not aesthetic.
Okay.
There's an essay, Susan Sontag, I believe, called Against Interpretation. And her argument is that the point of art is not being able to trace it back to the intentions of, or to the motives of the artist. Yeah, so I want to make paintings that do not ask you to do that. Like I think when you look at these, it's clear I'm not asking you to find your way back to my motivation. They're not about my childhood, you know. They're contemporary, like they're about stuff that happened last week, so I'm not asking you to go back anywhere. They're not done in the style of Giotto, so I'm not asking you to go back to some art historical reference. Yes?
The bird hand, writing things, like doing like 5 different jobs at once. And you like layer them on top of each other. And there's sort of the figure in the painting. Did they start off as hands and then turn into birds, start off as birds, and that's how you...
I imagine for our ancestors that's how it went too. When I see the first sculptures in art history books, it's like a knot on a stone. There's like a piece of the stone that looks kind of like a buffalo. And then somebody was like, oh, that looks kind of like a buffalo, right? And the other guy was like, I guess I don't see it. And then so the guy carved out the horn. It's like, oh yeah, that totally looks like a buffalo. And I think about cave painting a lot. So somebody asked me, how do I, this sounds bad, but how do I keep from getting better at painting? And the way that I keep from getting better is the collage elements and the breaking up the painting doesn't give me room to show how good of a painter I am. I also use fairly large brushes. So I can only paint for a minute before I'm broken and I have to paint for another minute. Yeah, so a lot of things happen. And the reason I think of cave painting in that way is because I don't think cave walls were flat surfaces waiting for somebody to do something to it. It was already a thing. And so before I paint the paintings, I build them. And when I build them, they're already a thing. And then I paint them in spite of the thing. Yeah, so I think that that is maybe something lost when painting on white rectangular canvases, is that the canvas wants you to paint it. That's what it was there for. And I like to paint these things in spite of their surfaces. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit more about the victim and how you know which ones are innocent and which ones are guilty?
I think that when there's only one figure in the piece, I should always start them as an innocent victim, and only go from there in a internally rational escalation. So there's the innocent, completely innocent victim. Then what would come next? A victim with partial guilt. There's more over there. I'll read them to you. So I have to leave. I'm going to go off camera for a second. This may be all of them, but I don't think so. I think there are 6 or 7 in total, and this isn't all of them. But this is an equally guilty victim. So probably we start with a completely innocent victim, then a victim with minor guilt, then an equally guilty victim, then a voluntary victim, and then finally is an imaginary victim. So the worst kind of person, I don't know whether the worst kind of person in this topology is a guilty victim or an imaginary victim. Like the worst person you can think of, Donald Trump or Slobodan Milosevic or what you like, they are victims in their own mind. You know, like Donald Trump could tell you how he's being victimized. And I think the difference between that and a guilty victim is that a guilty victim actually is a victim, but they're implicated in what happened to them. Yeah. And you know, I was reading in the New York Times, which obviously I read quite often. They were talking about how diversity, equity, and inclusion programs are going out of fashion now. So places are ending their programs and so forth. And this trainer was saying how he was taught to see the world as a binary opposition between oppressors and the oppressed, between victims and sinners, essentially. Socrates once said that it's better to be harmed than to do harm. So in a world where there are only victims and sinners, it's better to be a victim than a sinner. And yeah, there was an article in the Atlantic called The Rise of Victim Culture, where everyone conceptualizes themselves as a victim rather than a sinner, which of course as a Catholic I find offensive, right? You're all actually sinners and not victims at all. And there are topologies of sinners too, where everybody is a sinner. But I thought that this topology of victimhood, we could all see ourselves in it. Like we could all accept some degree of victimhood, right? But it's arbitrary.
It's totally arbitrary.
It's arbitrary. Sometimes nothing is totally arbitrary. There are some things that I'm like, no, I'm not gonna put that person in that position, and I put my thumb on the scale. Also, sometimes I search for a word, and like this one says, search result position 7, number 7. This is search result position number 2. This might be search result position 15, and some are search number 1. So sometimes I see something, I'm like, no, I'm not gonna do that one. and I go to the next. But I do record it so you can know that I'm not being totally honest or arbitrary.
Can an organization or an institution be a victim or a sinner or an oppressor?
I would probably, we're talking Catholic doctrine. I'm going to say no. I'm going to say that, okay, now we'll have to talk a little bit about original sin, okay? There are two schools of thought. One is that original sin is the sin of disobedience, and the eating of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil is arbitrary. God could have said, don't pick up that rock, and if you picked it up, that would have been the original sin. The other school of thought is that original sin is actually revealed to us by the eating of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. So God essentially set up a world. Remember, sin is inflicting suffering on another thing. So God built a world where things are constantly inflicting suffering upon each other and enduring suffering. But his world worked because none of the things were conscious of it. Once we became conscious of it, then we were in trouble, right? So lions commit sins all the time. Black holes commit sins, protons commit sins, but we're the only ones conscious of it. So yes, corporations commit sins just the same way that cats and dogs commit sins, or I should say they inflict suffering, but only we are aware of sin. So as individuals.
So how does that factor into the...
So AI cannot commit a sin.
Because it's their nature.
Yeah.
So how does that track with the communal, like, origination of meaning? So it requires an agreement to make meaning.
Yes. I have to say that looks like a swan, and you have to say, yeah.
So it requires an organization or a cooperation to create this meaning. But then in the creation of that meaning, you are not necessarily responsible for whether it is harmful or not harmful.
I like that question. You know, the second story in the Bible after the original sin is the sin of cooperation. I think that young people who are trying to find some way, some political strategy that does not produce suffering, does not inflict suffering on others, eventually they will understand that the only system is anarchy. And they're reproducing the Tower of Babel, that anytime we cooperate, we collectively produce suffering. That's just how the world works. So yes, the paintings might produce suffering in the viewer, but they are so beautiful. They are so beautiful. You know, I was very moved. The most moving thing I've ever experienced from a collector was they sent me a picture of them circumcising their baby in front of one of my Star of David paintings. And yes, this painting and its collective meaning in this painful political moment produces suffering. I imagine it must. But it's so beautiful. Hopefully, that's the idea. And how do I ensure that it's beautiful? Not in the same way that I think painters did in the generation before me, which was by holding back. So I think that I'm ensuring its beauty through pushing forward through it aesthetically. Every color, every person, every moment.
Because suffering is, on some level, inescapable, and this is a holistic system.
Yeah, and you know, there was a philosopher whose name was Schopenhauer, who wrote a book called The Suffering of the World, where he proposed that the reason why we define our existence through suffering is because suffering is actually the only positive experience. Joy is actually a negative experience. It's the lack of being on fire. And we cannot directly experience, like imagine a world where people were all immortal and nothing ever died. That would be a wonderful world, but they wouldn't experience it as a wonderful world because since they don't have anything to compare it to, they simply would not experience it at all. So Schopenhauer argued that identity has to be defined either through my own suffering and my movement in and out of it, or my observation of another person's suffering. So like when you volunteer at a soup kitchen, you can then go home and appreciate your life because now you have something to compare it to. Or if you are hungry, then you get a job. You can appreciate that for that short period of time that you can remember it, right? So we define our existence through either our own suffering or the suffering of the other person. There's also a great book called Afro-Pessimism, which talks about, because, you know, Schopenhauer thought about identity as a single thing, but now we think about, what do we call it? Intersectionality. You have more than one identity. I have a gender identity and a racial identity and so forth, but every one of them has to be defined by suffering, and suffering within that identity category. So like my gender identity, I'm a guy, and I define it through the suffering that I inflict upon gals. You know, guyness is the oppressor identity, and then galness is the oppressed identity, and that's how I define my gender identity. Yes?
I was just wondering how the mop heads got made.
How did the mop heads get made? There is not a good story about that. It was a good decision, but it was a random occurrence. I'm so glad that I went to Italy for this residency. One of the reasons is they don't sell stretcher bars in the quantities that I would need to make paintings. This is 30 like mops that I need. And they just don't sell stuff in quantities like that. There's no Costco in Rome. So I was like, what can I use in quantities that I need? And I decided to use broom handles. And I love that it's round on one end. It also reminds me of some police brutality things that happened in New York many years ago. And the other head was a screw for the mop to go on. And I always want to like disintegrate the painting in significance. So instead of dowels, which have no significance, only a function, I use spoons, which have both a function and a significance. The mops have both a function and a significance. Just piling it on. And I should be painting on clothing, which is fabric that has significance, right? But I can only do stuff if it emotionally makes sense. Like I can't just think up stuff and do it. Like that's a good idea, I'll make that painting. I have to be moved by what it actually looks like to make that step. Yes.
I was interested in how you talked about the complete painting for each of them, and therefore wanted to hear about what you think about the relationship between them. If they are all considered complete, do they then become in isolation, or then how do they then speak to each other if at all?
There is a failure of completion, which is the source of the shape of the canvas, right? And the attempt that the older guys made, and gals, in painting, was to use the rectangle as some kind of universal shape or something like that. But I think that, and then the rectangle for me is that thing on the back, that tall thing on the back, which is a gallows that the painting then hangs from. It's also a guillotine, the angle of the whatchamajiggins. You know what? Magicians, they propose stuff. Difference between a magician and like a stunt man is that a magician proposes interesting things. Like I'm gonna saw a lady in half and then put her back together again. And the interest is in the proposition and in the coherent maintenance of a proposition. Like watch me, I'm doing this and now I'm doing that. Whereas a stunt man, the interest is not in the proposition. I'm gonna jump a motorcycle over 20 helicopters. That's not an interesting proposition. It's only logistically interesting. Like, where did he get all those helicopters? Like, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So these paintings fail at what they propose. I've always read about art since I was a little kid, and I remember reading about like Picasso and the idea of what Cubism does, right? Of like creating the third dimension within this painting and so forth. And I always knew that nothing could do that. Like you would need like a scientific device to do such a thing. But I understood that it was a proposition that his work coherently generated. So I'm trying to coherently generate the proposition of completion in the paintings. And the square wouldn't have worked because then it would have had that painting thing of, man, this guy likes paintings and he went home and made one. Or he doesn't like paintings. Like he made a rectangle out of mops because he's like, fuck you, painting. Whereas these, I hope they seem like I just didn't know any better.
I'm very curious about the way that you order information, and that the information has a very specific, when you talk about specificity, and that things have, you know, that the painting has a very specific location, be it the HTML or the names of the people involved. And then this thing that happens, is this by virtue of it being a painting? I'm thinking about the very notion of them being abstract is not ordered information necessarily, right? The idea that you are taking this hand image that comes from, you know, for lack of like, you know, for lack of specificity, 60 cave, or I think of like, you know, someone putting their hand on the wall and spitting paint on it, but it's a collage. It's not, you know, it's a collage before it's a painting. And so, how does that inform your notion of anarchy?
Right, which is the only ultimate political system, would be anarchy, where we stop, and that's what God tried to do with the Tower of Babel, is to stop us from sinning by preventing us from cooperating. Yeah, I imagine, you know, my ideal audience would be like a post-apocalyptic person, or like a caveman who was transported into the room. Because I think they would believe the paintings. I don't think that they would think that they were simply something that people did. I think that they would think that some person did it for some reason. And that might be a kind of anarchy. Like, you know, Henry Darger, like you go into his garage and you discover this stuff. Yeah, so I think of that in terms of anarchy. Hierarchy of information, text has to come first, right? And then text is the first thing lost through time. Because very soon, these URLs won't mean anything. Like soon, the internet will not work that way. And people won't be able to check that. So it's the first to come and the first to leave.
But wouldn't symbol come before text?
I don't think so. Well, maybe only one, which is the Star of David. The others come next, like this being a TP comes after reading it. That being a diamond. Maybe this too, maybe the two stars. Because somehow they are also language, pentagram, Star of David. I think of the Big Dipper, which I don't think there's a mythology about the Big Dipper. It just really looks like a Big Dipper. But it's not like Zeus's dipper. Is it?
It's the big bear. Ursa Major.
A bear protected one of these abandoned children.
Wait, the Big Dipper.
Yeah.
Okay. But it looks more like a dipper than a bear.
Yeah.
Okay. I face this dilemma sometimes with the paintings where I'm like, that doesn't really look like a diamond. But
I mean, the fish is Catholic. Put it on the back of your car.
Yeah, I was just curious about the hanging of the structures and the wooden spoons. And like you said, like the spoons and mops are like these things that have significance
idea or theory about like the relationship between abstraction and like the concrete, abstract and the concrete, because it's like they're also both these things that like support the daily maintenance of like life, cooking and cleaning. But I just don't know, like, I can't quite figure it out if there's like a proposal there if it's like the concrete supports the abstract, but then this like abstract surface is made up of, or this, the symbol that refers to something concrete is made of something that refers to something concrete. It's like very convoluted.
Yes. I think that you've described it. The way that stuff comes into my language, the belts, the mops, the spoons. Who did I mention wrote Against Interpretation? Susan Sontag. She once described avant-gardism as art which is on the run from itself. And I don't want to be on the run from my work, but I am. Like, I'm so afraid of my work that I'm running away from it. So to negotiate, I run in a circle around it. So I'm always getting further away from it, but I'm also making another pass and seeing it again. So in a way, I don't move fast enough away from what I use, and these are always a kind of evolution. So the belts come in from a reference to suicide. That's how they entered the paintings, and that's what they still are. They're a reference to suicide, and to gender, they're always women's belts. Because I'm trying to eat the entire world. And I guess you couldn't eat the whole world by running in a straight line. You know, you would have to do that. Sorry.
I said, who the belts from? Are you sourcing them from?
Go on. Who could I possibly be sourcing? No, I just get them from the store.
Okay.
I wonder if you could talk about the decision, kind of bring up some like darker and like there's a lot of de-skilling, because it seems like intentional de-skilling. So why choose to make them off when you can just buy one?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think a conceptualist who made really smart work would be running in a straight line and having good ideas. I wanted to buy mops. I think I wanted brooms originally. But in Rome, it was impossible. It's very difficult to buy like an archetypical broom, what you think of as a broom. And then I was like, maybe I'll buy mops. Maybe that'll be easier. But then I was like, well, you can't make a car, but you can make a mop. So these are mops, I made them, right? Could you make a belt? I'm not sure I could make a belt. I could, of course, take a strip of fabric and tie it in a knot, but that's not really a belt yet. And I'm not sure I could make a belt. So it's stuff like that. The only mops I could get are pre-lacquered. Before I used unlacquered, but maybe the lacquered is better. I can't rub the paint on the lacquered mops, it won't stick. Yeah, but I'm just running away, but in a circle. And the de-skilling, I work hard to prevent myself from getting better at making them. The way that I do it is, so I always start with a TP, then I move to a diamond, then I move to a pentagram, then I move to the Star of David, then I move to the sun, then I move to the fish, then I move to the arrow. And that might take me a year to do those paintings. And then I start over again at the TP. And the reason is because by the time I get back to the TP, I've forgotten how to make it. And so the next TP is different. So that is one thing, is to make myself forget by keep doing a pattern of different things. And also the collage prevents me from having a straight run. So that prevents me from showing how good I am. If I had like a big rectangular canvas, I could show you how well I can paint. But there's not enough room. So I'm kind of desperately trying to show you in little pieces how well I can paint. Yeah. I hope they look okay.